I'm John Batchelor. I welcome Sohrab Ahmari of the Wall Street Journal. He has a piece up now reviewing a new book about Iran. Sohrab is an Iranian, and he understands carefully the intricacies of Iranian history, having met now with a tyranny that is unacceptable to the Iranian people. It's led by the supreme leader. It's a cabal, really. It's the Twelvers of Tehran. It's a very small crowd. It's represented right now by the newly elected president of Iran, a man who's called a moderate cleric. He has been a stooge of the Twelvers since the revolution in 79. To my reading, he is now speaking to the United Nations in these last hours. The book that Sohrab is reviewing in the Wall Street Journal, it's up on your site now, is a new book called Unthinkable: Iran, the Bomb, and American Strategy by Kenneth Pollock, who's a distinguished scholar and observer at the Brookings Institute, where he's a fellow. He's a former National Security Council staffer for the Clinton administration. Sohrab, a very good evening to you. Your review is lucid, and in it, here's what I learned. Mr. Brookings is arguing that there is only one choice with regard to Iran and its suspect nuclear weapons program. It's called learning to live with Iran. Have I read your review of Mr. Brookings correctly? Good evening to you.
Thanks for having me, John. Ken Pollock is, as you said, he's a very thoughtful commentator, and he before he was at the National Security Council, he was an analyst for the CIA working on Iran-Iraq issues. But more or less, he's come to the conclusion, and he's certainly not considered a softie on Iran. He's generally considered one of the hawks, but he's come to the conclusion that as between the two options that we have, which is to either strike now to delay the Iranian nuclear program or maybe destroy it, or to contain or learn to live with a nuclear Iran, that the latter might be the choice that we should go with.
Learning to live with Iran. That means that here going forward, the United States of America, its foreign policy, and the voters who put the leaders of the foreign policy into place have to accept the fact that the Iranian people will live in slavery and fear for the indefinite future. Isn't that what Mr. Pollock is recommending? We are writing off millions of people who now suffer at the hands of the coup.
Well, to be fair to Ken Pollock, that's not quite his vision of containment. In other words, the way he sees containment is, I disagree with this, by the way, but to give a full sense of his argument, it's the idea that we would box off Iran and deter them through, drawing red lines to make sure that they don't encroach on our allies in the Arab world, and certainly not on Israel and other American interests in the Middle East and North Africa. But in the meanwhile, we would also apply other sorts of pressures, including ideological warfare, support for dissidents, and so forth, in order to bring about a long-term political transformation in Iran. Now, I happen to think that we won't be able to contain Iran militarily, and that therefore that seems to me to be a pipe dream. But it's not the case that he says, let's just leave the Iranians to the mercy of the regime.
Does that mean we're going to enter a Cold War where Iran has the bomb, we have overwhelming force, and we're balanced back and forth with each other as we fence in the region? Is that where we're headed? And I want your opinion here, Sohrab.
Sure.
I'm keen on your measure of this, not just Mr. Pollock's.
I mean, I think that is his vision, is of wearing down the Iranians. Mm-hmm. The reason I think that won't work, there are actually a number of reasons. The first is that whenever we've tried to contain a regime, we've had a serious deployment of troops and forces around the periphery of that regime.
Right.
And we've been ready to use those forces. In other words, when we were in the containment scenario with the Cold War, people somehow think containment means no conflict. It's in fact the opposite. In order to contain communism, we went to war in a number of occasions, and in a couple of times we came very close to the nuclear brink. So therefore, it's not the case that when you say we're going to contain, it's a conflict-free option. Now, in the current Iranian case, we're actually withdrawing from the Middle East, more or less. The Obama administration is determined to pivot, quote unquote, away from the Middle East. So it seems strange to believe that we can contain them if we're not going to be present in a very serious way. That's one problem. The second problem. Oh, go ahead.
No, the president today said nothing to suggest that he was going to deploy American forces to the borders of Iran or in any way challenge them. Not only withdrawing from the Middle East, I did not hear him in any way make mention of putting the fleet into the Gulf or watching Iran very carefully. Did you hear it?
Nothing of the sort. The president, I mean, the case of the person who, let me mention this, the person who very shamefully didn't say anything about human rights in Iran, by the way, was the president. Not a word about Iran, the Iranian people's aspirations, whether or not it's all of the Iranian people or some of them or a substantial number. But you're correct. He didn't say a word about what the stick would be if the Iranian regime failed to take up this carrot of one more time of attempting to engage and to reach out diplomatically.
Your second point, Sohrab, I interrupted, please.
And I think it's exactly, it follows up on what you were saying, which is that this idea of containment, it requires us sending a message psychologically to not just the adversary itself, meaning the mullahs in Tehran, but also our Arab allies and the Israelis, that we would actually be seriously ready to act in case Iran crosses the whatever red lines that we put in place. Already, when Iran isn't a nuclear power, the U.S. has dithered over a number of times when the Iranians have crossed red lines, and suddenly Assad has crossed the president's own red lines, although now he says, no, it was never my red lines, it was the world's red line. But how can we be certain that when there's a nuclear regime that you're dealing with, that we would be willing to confront it if it crosses our red line, when it's not nuclear, we've already acquiesced on so many occasions, be it whether they've use IEDs against troops in Iraq or funded Taliban operations against our forces. We haven't responded already, and that was when they were not nuclear. How could we possibly think that we would respond when they have the world's deadliest weapon in their hands?
Sohrab Ahmari is an assistant books editor at The Journal. The book, Kenneth Pollock's Unthinkable, Iran, the Bomb, and American Strategy. I look forward to reading it. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show.